I must apologize. I'm going to have to talk in English. And I try not to talk too quickly, but obviously we want to leave time for questions. First, thank you for the invitation. Thank you for hosting the conference and having us here. And from our point of view, a particularly warm thank you to October High Institute, who are hosting us this week. I'm going to talk about some of the key trends in Europe. Now, I really enjoyed the heritage presentations just before us, because there are many key themes in common in terms of the evolution and reuse of space and buildings. So I'm going to pick up some of that. Some will relate to new buildings and places, and some old. We have done this by looking at the European cities. The great places that we visit are under the Academy of Urbanism, with architects, planners, landscape, engineers, culture, and community specialists. So they visit and assess them. You see on the map there some of the places that we have visited. And we have been doing this since 2006, and we publish our results in a series of publications of books and magazines. So we study the places and we try to share the learning. So my presentation is picking up 6 key themes from an urbanism perspective. So not just design, not just development, not just planning. It's the place, it's the mix. So the first one is around strategic visioning. The places we have found that have the most success have a long-term approach, and they try to shape their own future. So places like Helsinki, who have been looking 30, 40, 50 years ahead. Helsinki, unlike Cairo, has a shrinking population, a shrinking Finnish population, so it has to plan to import population. Places like Glasgow in Scotland, where they're looking 50 years, or in 2011, 50 years to 2061. How do we do that? We look backwards 50 years and understand how much things have changed in housing, in health, in education, in public space. So we try to take the stories from that period and bring it forward and think, what is happening for the next 50 years? What is happening to the demographics, to the mix of ethnicities and cultures in the different cities? What about young people? What is the proportion of young people, and how do they influence things in a way that affects their needs? And we will be picking up from the young students in the next session some of the thinking about the future capital city outside Cairo. What about old people, obviously? Because in many societies and many cities, the population is living longer, to be 80, 90, 100 years old or more. So cities like Lisbon on the left, who have a lot of older people in the old Medina, in the old city centre, which is very hilly. They have not just steps, but they have lifts and elevators to help the residents, but also the tourists, because many of the tourists visiting Lisbon are older. So thinking about age and mobility is a key part. The leading cities also have frameworks. These frameworks tend to be physical. So for you as architects, this is not new, but for many people, this is 3-dimensional frameworks, thinking in 3 dimensions of topography and buildings, not just land use, which is what many of the plans of the weaker cities have had, or perhaps just engineering projects of infrastructure. So the difficulty, if there is no design, if there is no place thinking, is we end up with stuff, railings, signs, but no real sense of place. So good examples include Gothenburg in Sweden, Lisbon in Portugal, and Hafen City, the Hamburg Harbour area, which has been redeveloped. But it's like the Nile, it's a very floodable part of the river Elbe in Germany, so they have to have buildings which are raised for sustainability and flood protection, one level above the ground level. At a slower pace are cities like Antwerp in Belgium, where the scale of population and scale of development is slower, but they are still making incremental change with buildings and spaces. So here on the left, more space for people, taking away the vehicle space, and on the right, changing a garage, this is a motor car garage, into a library. So it makes it a community civic space. And their approach is called slow urbanism. You've heard about Freiburg already from Hussam, and in that example we prepared a charter of good principles with them, and they think a lot about microclimate, drawing the wind off of the hills of the Black Forest to cool the city because the city gets very hot in the summer. You may think it's an old city, but also it's effectively a new city because it had to be rebuilt in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And instead of rebuilding in a modern style, they went back to the traditional street structure and rebuilt in that approach. So it looks and feels like a traditional city, but it's largely modern, with streets like the one on the right dating from the 1980s. So they are taking the principles from the historic city and applying it to the new, including introducing completely new neighborhoods connected by tram with higher density housing and so on. This idea of evolution from the past and the tradition into the future can be applied in many ways. So examples here in streetscape pedestrianization from Glasgow, where they start first by removing the cars, then they paint the street and some occasional planting, and progressively redesign the street with higher quality materials when they can afford it, when they have the money and resources. So that is now a leading commercial street because of that progressive plan that was very sensitive to the heritage and conservation. One of the biggest things we discovered is the idea of a city making its infrastructure a strong positive place-making element. So in the 1980s and 90s particularly, many cities undertook big iconic projects, museums, galleries. Museums like this one in Salford. If anyone knows in the room football, this is close to the Manchester United football ground, so it's a big heritage attraction, an iconic building. But now a progressive rethinking. So even this gallery in Aarhus, the experience of the gallery is also the experience of the city, trying to look at the city as a whole and add the new infrastructure in a way that adds not just to the cultural venue, but the experience of the city as a whole. So this idea is a shift from viewing infrastructure just as provision of roads or canals or railways or bridges, the old way. Now, if we have to have these things, they add something significant to the quality of the experience of the citizens and the visitors. So even canals and rivers, which were once commercial and industrial, now become positive elements of neighborhoods, of places. New bridges add to commercial districts, or to residential districts, or to tourism districts. So the design of the bridge becomes more than just does it work for traffic or pedestrians, it has to work for the location. This one is another one in Glasgow. And here is a surprise. In Oslo, normally a railway station, you would want the housing to face away from the trains. Here you have housing facing the railway and looking out beyond the rail. So this made the railway station feel safe, and the people didn't mind watching the trains coming and going. So there you're getting an integration of ideas and concepts. This kind of thinking in Freiburg means, remember I said taking the wind off of the hills as it heats up, drawing it down a tram route, a transit route, a metro route that is also a park with trees, and you see it's also a drainage system to take the rain. So this is multifunctional transit route playing a role in the local area. In Bordeaux, in France, similar thinking, where a tram stop, a transit stop, becomes a place. It's a place that's safe and comfortable for people, and it has a design identity. At the extreme element, they even remove the overhead tram catenaries. You could see there are no wires, and it becomes a very distinctive place. So it is working with the heritage and identity of the location. This is on the edge of the river. It was a very industrial location for shipping and export of produce in Bordeaux. And here there is a mirror pool which water comes up and down, and a tram system with no overhead. So you can see they're trying to create a quality of environment of placemaking from that situation. These things don't have to be expensive. The example here from Freiburg is simply a water channel. Now, I can tell you now, in the UK, there is no way that would be allowed because it would be considered dangerous, but in Germany, that is considered part of the experience of the city. And even outside in the neighborhoods I showed you, the mechanisms to be able to take water when there is water help to suppress the risk of flood, but they also help to create wildlife and green space. In Oslo, they even demolished buildings in an industrial area, opened up the culverts, opened up the water under the ground to create an area of greenery that also made it more attractive for the businesses in the locality, in the business park, and also managed to raise the rent. Greenery is sometimes a temporary use. In many of the examples, it's difficult to sustain. It can be costly. Here in Birmingham, it is there before a new development and a new station goes in. Here in Glasgow, it is before new housing goes in. So this is greening as temporary environmental improvement. You can see there, it becomes a whole new village next to the river with sustainability built in. And these are very energy efficient homes. The kind of thing that we've also come across is rethinking, as Hussam said, streets. Decluttering. So not the main roads, the main intercity roads, but within streets and neighborhoods, removing things, slowing the traffic down to about 20 kilometers per hour or less, using the principle that we used to be able to walk when there were vehicles 50 or 100 years ago. So there's 100 years ago with people walking, horses, carts, dogs. Here's 50 years ago, motorbikes, but it's still a mix of people and vehicles. And the experimentation in some places has included on one day a week or one day a month, removing traffic completely to test what happens. Does this make it safer? In this instance, it's Gothenburg. Sometimes the good examples have come from Bordeaux. By removing vehicles for one day, does it make it safe? How does it affect business? How does it affect life? In other instances, occasional slow traffic allowed through the areas. That example is from Brighton. Some of the theory for this comes from Holland, the Netherlands, where they have a concept of mixing people and streets in either, they're often called shared surfaces or shared streets, where people are walking in amongst traffic. This man who recently died, he died last month, this man called Ben Hamilton Bailey, he didn't die as a result of his work. He died because he'd been unwell for a year. Lovely man, did fantastic work trying to explain that if you slow the traffic down, and you have the eye contact of the driver, the relationship between the driver and the pedestrian or the cyclist is different. So the psychology is different if you slow right down. I've worked on him with projects, and he did do that. He is a little bit crazy, or he was rather. Another example of integration here from Hamburg. Sorry, no, yes, it's Hamburg. It's Hafen City in Hamburg. The headquarters of Unilever, so big commercial company, allowing public access through the building. Next to the river, so people can sit by the river. So the idea of a private building also having public access, a bit like perhaps a hotel or some other building. In the examples we studied, density was a key, and it's obviously a key factor here in Cairo, as in many cities, but not just in terms of numbers, but the livability for local shops, for local services, for transport, and for things like schools, libraries, and so on. So getting the right density is important to support things. In some of the cities, they have tram systems, not all, but it means that not everyone is in cars. This example from Freiburg, and that one from Manchester. Obviously, more attractive in Germany, a bit less attractive in Manchester. Here, the density in Oslo is from the redevelopment of a hospital. So a hospital, quite a big building, redevelopment for residential with high quality landscape, but within walking distance of the center of Oslo. Now, anybody who follows the media and the press and the journals may pick up, Oslo is now looking to pedestrianize the whole of its core area and make it all walkable and squeeze traffic outside. Even if the buildings are highly efficient in terms of energy sustainability, if the density is too low, they may still mean that people have to use their cars. So there is a challenge in Bordeaux, for instance. That example is new housing in Scotland, but the density is still too low. The new housing in Bordeaux is tending to have to be higher density than the old because it can't support the shops and the services. 100 years ago, there might be 4 or 5 people living in one house. Now, 1 or 2. So the density has fallen for the same amount of homes. That's part of the need for the shift. Hussam has already mentioned this. There's a huge preoccupation, and I know it's a big concern in Egypt with air quality, with health. How do we make sure we progress from how things have been in terms of quality of life, of air quality, of poverty? Places like Lisbon, even without a lot of money. So Lisbon had a very tough time after the financial crash, looked to regenerate certain neighborhoods, including poor neighborhoods, to continue making them livable. So refurbishment, they're not always heritage buildings protected, but they are important. The risk is if we just demolish all our heritage, all our historic buildings, and we simply build new. So these are both from Glasgow, slum clearance, traditional buildings demolished and cleared. We create new slums, perhaps. And then we have to demolish them. So one of the things when we studied and we visited Istanbul and the huge growth there was we thought, that's interesting. Istanbul is now building what we were building 40 or 50 years ago. And this is what's happening in Glasgow. The high density is coming down because it is not effective, but by dropping the high density, you reduce the population to support the shops and services. So you still need the density. The good examples in Istanbul had a mix of higher density, mid-density, and lower density around the mosque and shops. So the anchor was the mosque and the shops and the mix beyond that. Play is important for children as part of the safety, and some of the leading examples are about bringing people together in the districts and the neighborhoods. So not just housing. Schools, play, shops, markets, and obviously religious institutions there. It's a church in Germany. It's a mosque elsewhere. In some places it's a Gurdwara temple in others. But places to bring people together are very important. So just some more on greenness. There is a big issue with energy, the cost of energy, where it comes from, how resilient it is. And Freiburg pays a lot of regard to that, both in terms of the production of it and minimizing the consumption of energy in the buildings. So these are, a lot of the buildings there are highly, what's the word? Insulated, highly insulated, refurbished insulated, but also new, including this kind of example of passive house. So effectively, the energy created from the solar gain is going into the electrical system locally. You need a mindset to progress from certain kinds of quality energy approaches. You can't just switch it on and off. You have to progress that over time. And it is linked not just to energy systems, but it's linked to a philosophy of greening, to create shade, greening sometimes to retain water. This example is our Academy building in London. This is on the roof in the centre of the City of London. We've got that kind of quality of environment, and when we go to that roof, we see many other roofs are also green. So this is becoming a more important element in many of the cities, greening and growing food and having a culture that draws upon the local identity. And I know it's a big challenge in terms of the likes of the new city we will be hearing about shortly. It would be remiss of me not to mention economy. Many of the cities that have problems have had a changed economy. So we have looked at cities with mining or industry or shipbuilding, for instance, that have changed. The industries have gone, they've maybe gone to Korea or Japan or wherever. So the issue of how does the economy work and how do they attract jobs, businesses, skills, technology, and often the placemaking element is part of that. So for instance, attractive designed research facilities in Oslo are to attract global researchers and designers. These examples in Gothenburg are to attract students and workers and residents in partnership with Volvo and the university, which is Chalmers University there. Food is part of the identity issue. It's not simply design. Food and culture, whether that food is fish or meat or vegetables, this is one of the great ones in Valencia, this has become a big part. So we found it really fascinating studying Egyptian, Syrian, other kinds of Middle Eastern food and how it works. It's a big issue. This example, bizarrely you might say, the big issue in Bristol here is different kinds of falafel. But that's a big attraction in that city. So food, the ability to get good quality food, affordable food, locally, is a major part of the health and well-being of the cities. You can see it in the people, you can see it in their faces and so on. Some of that is grown locally and some of it is imported, but much less is imported than the places that aren't having local markets and local food. Lastly, on cycling, this is, as Hussam has alluded to, this is a big shift. It's a big shift globally. I know this is very challenging in the warmer climate in Egypt, but it's a big way of getting people mobile, and it does have an impact on health. It's not just cycles and cycle provision, it's also changing facilities in offices and libraries and shops to help reinforce it. So that idea of people being outside, being able to move around freely and safely is a big strand. Some of the places like Tokyo are reinforcing this with digital apps to get people out walking, cycling, moving around. So the penguins here are something that helps draw people to attractions and key facilities. This is Bristol again, where they took the traffic away from the street and they had a slide down the street for a period. So the street becomes a fun fair, it becomes an experience, not just for cars and buses and traffic, it becomes a place for the people, so the whole city can get out there and literally they can dance with the mayor. The mayor is the man in the red trousers who's an architect, just like the people in the room, an architect who became mayor of Bristol and decided it's not just about buildings, it's about people and place. So that comes to the final point, which is If that is the case, we have to design with people. We can't simply impose solutions top down. We have to go out and meet people, talk to them, hear their issues, and to build the ideas of different generations into the solutions for the future. Because some of these plans take not just 5 or 10 years, they take 20, 30, or 40 years. So these are examples of going out and involving people in the plan making. And I have to say, in Glasgow, some of these were where young people said, we need more safe cycling provision. And I said, but it's raining in Glasgow and it's hilly. And they said, if you don't give us cycling provision, we will go to Amsterdam, we will go to Cambridge, we will leave the city. We want cycling provision. So now the city are providing new cycle lanes. So going out to meet people, helping them work through the ideas and to build plans together. So charrette processes, I've heard the mention of charrette earlier today. Charrette processes are part of this, which we have done this week with role play that the students have undertaken. It helps bring different kinds of intelligence, different sectors, from residents, from business, from young people, from old, and it builds stronger plans. So what we've learned is that even though there still are some design and architectural icons, planning as placemaking and is not just about design and development and land use. It's also about the small things, the microscopic things, the daily experience that relates to culture, health, safety, experience. And the leadership of that comes from architects, planners, in this instance, the mayor of Aarhus in Denmark, thinking about how to involve the citizens in transforming the place. The good places have a plan, they deliver it. They update the plan, they then deliver that part. And they progressively build on the positive elements in each generation, just like we've seen over the generations in Egypt and in Cairo in particular. The danger is if we pull down or we change it each time, we have projects, but we have no progression. It's not getting better for the citizens. And here's the danger we had to show some people in Scotland. The risk is we have a plan, but we can't agree on how to do it. So we have another plan. We get a famous architect from somewhere, from America or somewhere, but we can't agree on how to do that, or we've got no money. And each time we keep preparing a new plan, there is no improvement for the citizens. So the risk is we don't get improvement if we don't think and act differently. Because the place is not simply about the buildings, it's a drama that includes people, children, old, young, and in this case, some animals. I hope there is something in there that resonates with you and that you can think about, because we used some of this thinking in the charrette process we've undertaken with students, which you're very welcome to attend in the next session, where we'll be talking about their approach to the proposed new city, where they were invited to review and revisit the new capital city. We did actually go out and visit it, as you can see there, and they did fantastic, intensive work over the last 4 or 5 days. It may feel like 10 days, but it's only 4 or 5, and those of you who are interested can see it later. So thank you very much for listening.